James Monroe was another Republican president, and in fact another Virginian. By the time Monroe was elected president in 1816, people spoke of a Virginia dynasty. George Washington had been a Virginian, became the first president. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, another Virginian. James Madison, a Virginian. Now James Monroe, a Virginian. And so it looked as though the Virginians were basically claiming the White House, the presidency, as their own territory. Monroe's presidency was marked by a decline in the bitter partisanship that had raged in American politics from the early 1790s. And this was largely a result of the demise of the Federalist Party. The Federalists had strongly opposed the War of 1812 and had even spoken of secession on the part of Federalist-dominated New England states. This sounded okay, it sounded even smart, as long as the war was going badly, but when the war turned suddenly promising for the United States with Andrew Jackson's victory at the end, the Federalists looked like bad losers and perhaps even treasonous. So the Federalists largely went away, and James Monroe presided over something that was called at the time the era of good feelings. What this meant was that the party strife of the previous couple of decades had worn away, and there was anything like it. In fact, when Monroe ran for re-election in 1820, he was essentially unopposed. The only president in American history, with the exception of George Washington, who's an exception on all sorts of things, to do that. So Monroe's administration was not marked by great turmoil, nor by great accomplishment. But he did a couple of things good. He did, well, in fact, I'll say one thing he did very well, and another thing, well, I'll get to that. So the best thing that James Monroe did was to appoint John Quincy Adams Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, and he had been trained for government service from the time he was a boy. He served as a secretary to his father, John Adams, when John Adams was America's minister in Britain and had promoted American interests in other foreign countries, American envoy to other countries. So John Quincy Adams took notes. He was very well educated. He spoke several languages. He knew as much about the world as anybody in the United States. He made a great candidate for Secretary of State. And in fact, his accomplishments as Secretary of State, largely in rectifying outstanding issues between the United States and Britain, the United States and Spain. It was under John Quincy Adams that the United States acquired Florida and regularized the border between the United States and Canada. The United States made its first recognized claim to the Oregon country. John Quincy Adams was the consummate diplomat. Now keep this in mind. In fact, historians would eventually come to conclude that John Quincy Adams was probably the greatest Secretary of State in American history. Hold this thought for a moment, because John Quincy Adams is going to become President of the United States, and he's not going to do so well as President. It's a reminder that in American politics, accomplishment, advance, can come along two tracks. One is the elective track, so you get elected President, and you do well or poorly as President. The other is the appointive track. Some President appoints you to a particular position. John Quincy Adams was as successful on the appointive track as anybody has ever been in American politics. As we will see, his presidency was less successful. So, James Monroe's number one success, the high point, the best of his presidency, was the appointment of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. James Monroe's low point, well, I wouldn't call it a low point exactly, but maybe his most overrated point, and that's a little bit different, I'll admit, was the promulgation, the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine, which, by the way, was largely designed, authored by John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. The Monroe Doctrine asserted essentially that the Americas and Europe were two different worlds. The New World and the Old World were separate. Europe ought to confine itself to the Old World. America, the United States, would take care of the Americas. It was a statement that gave rise to the Monroe Doctrine, the first of its kind. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't called a doctrine for many years afterwards. And in fact, almost nobody paid much attention to it. So this is the reason the Monroe Doctrine, I say it's overrated. The Monroe Doctrine was not called a doctrine for decades. It wasn't even mentioned as a precedent or a principle or a policy that anybody should hang a hook on for decades. And in fact, it was enforced not by the United States, but by Britain. Now, it was John Quincy Adams' shrewdness to realize that that's exactly what would happen. The British would say, the British didn't want new European adventures in the New World any more than the United States did. And so it was clever of John Quincy Adams to have the President Monroe, announce this policy, and then the British Navy to enforce it. But over the years, the Monroe Doctrine would acquire a kind of legitimacy in American politics. But it had no legitimacy in the sense that it wasn't approved by Congress. It was simply an announcement of something by a president. It certainly didn't have the approval of the other countries of the Americas to which it applied. But nonetheless, it gave rise to this idea that serious presidents in foreign policy ought to have doctrines or corollaries to doctrine. We'll get to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And there would be other doctrines. There would be an Eisenhower doctrine. There would be a Johnson doctrine. There would be a Reagan doctrine. There would be a Clinton doctrine. So there was a Truman doctrine. Everybody had to have a doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine, which gave rise to this practice, was overrated for a long period of time, and perhaps overrated during its entire existence. Is it still in effect? It's kind of hard to say. The thing about doctrines is, because they're never actually enacted, they're hardly ever repealed. But there we have it. So James Monroe, the best thing he did was to appoint John Quincy Adams Secretary of State. The worst or the most overrated thing he did was to announce the Monroe Doctrine.